The first annotation that I made was in The Badger by John Clare, and I made this. I had a colon, which means I connected it back to something we talked about before, and the passage I connected back to was, "When midnight comes, a host of dogs and men go out and track the badger to his den, and put a sack within the hole, and lie till the old grunting badger passes by." And the reason I could connect this back to something that I experienced previously was during class we talked about the idea that in trying to kill the badger, it makes humans more like animals, and it switches places that the animal is now being hunted by other animals. And we talked about this being a pathetic appeal that the author was making because it doesn't seem right that people who are supposed to be kind and caring are now turning into animals, just trying to kill, as the author puts it, an old grunting badger. It just doesn't seem right to the normal person. The second annotation I made was, again, in The Badger. It was for the passage, "He runs along and bites all he meets. They shout and hollow down the noisy streets. He turns about to face the loud uproar and drives the rebels to their very door." I again used a colon for this passage because I thought it connects to both what we were talking about in class and a lot of what we cover in high school, the idea of man versus wild. Because here the tides turn a little bit. Instead of men hunting the badger is now fighting off all the men, and it seems to be a struggle to the end as to how the badger and the men are going to fight this out. Who's going to win in the end? Will nature prevail? Will the wild badger be the winner here, or will men be the winner here? The final annotation that I made on the badger was for a passage that says, "Some keep a baited badger tame as a hog and tame until he follows like the dog." And I put an exclamation point against or right next to this passage because it didn't seem quite right to me, but yet it still seems to connect back to what we do in normal days. I said, this seems awful, but people still try to tame wild animals. And I can see this, and there's many people who keep tigers, lions, animals that really truly do belong in their natural habitat, but they try to tame them and keep them as pets, and even though there are laws against it, it still happens. So this kind of showed a precursor to what we do in everyday life now. Even dogs had to be tamed at some point from a wild animal to be our pets. The first annotation that I created for the poem "A Narrow Fell in the Grass" by Emily Dickinson occurred in the first stanza, and it stated, "Occasionally rides, you may have met him, did you not? His notice is sudden." And I put a question mark next to this because I didn't quite understand it at first, and I said, "How can a snake ride in the grass?" And I made this annotation after I had completed reading the poem, and I had gotten an understanding that there was a good chance that the author was talking about a snake in this poem. And this is just one of the techniques I think she uses to throw the reader off, to say, well, maybe it isn't just talking about a snake, could it possibly be? And it's something that she uses to make the reader wonder and ponder, saying, it's also partially descriptive, saying, could a snake really ride in the grass? It's to picture it. The second annotation that I made for "A Narrow Fell in the Grass" by Emily Dickinson was, I underlined just the word the words nature's people, and I put an exclamation point about this because it surprised me, because this is really the main point where I see that she's talking about something other than a person. It was my really big hint that this was not a poem about a person. She said several of nature's people, which caught my eye because if she had been talking about any human or any normal person, she probably would have just referred to it as a person, not of nature's people. It let me know that she was most likely talking about an animal, or in this case, she's talking about a reptile. She's talking about something that is out in nature and it lives in nature, and it was my first real indication that this was a snake that she was talking about, and it really put things in perspective for me for the rest of the poem. The final annotation that I made for "An Arrow Fell in the Grass" by Emily Dickinson was for the last stanza, the last two lines to be particular. And this really just made it set in concrete that we were talking about a snake, because it was something that I could connect to. The author states, "Without a tired breathing or a zero at the ballroom." And she's talking about what she feels when she sees this narrow fell in the grass, this nature's person. And up until this point, you really could have been talking about any sort of animal that represented something that looked like a snake. It could have been a worm, it could have been anything else. But this specific stanza shows fear, and I'm personally afraid of snakes, and I'm assuming that's how the author feels about snakes, because this passage really shows, or it portrays the fear. So I can connect to how the author feels when she's talking about the snake. That she's nervous, she can't breathe, she feels fear all the way down to her bones. The first annotation that I made for the Loon on Forrester's Pond by Hayden Carruth was a passage that said, "It came from inside the long wilderness of my life, a loon's song, and there he was swimming on the pond." I put a question mark next to this because previously in the poem, the author mentions the summer wilderness, the blue light, he's talking about a pond, and yet here he talks about that the sound he heard comes from the long wilderness of my life, making me seem that it's inside him. So I was confused as to whether if this was actually happening in real life, or if this was a hallucination or part of the author's imagination as to what he was doing. I wrote down, "This confuses me. Is it real? What is the author talking about here? Is this really in real life? Does he hear this loon? Or is this something he's imagining because of deep sorrow or a depression that he's going through?" The second annotation that I made for the Loon on Forrester's Pond was down near the end of the first stanza, when the author states, "It had ejected a plume of white excrement curving behind. It was beautiful," he said. Next to this point in the poem, I put down a question mark because I was puzzled by the fact that the author could make something that obviously normally is not seen as a beautiful act to be something that's so beautiful. The author puts the words so delicately together and in such a way that even though the loon is doing something that's normally disgusting and seen as unsanitary, it's something that's turned into beautiful. It makes everything that the loon does seem beautiful. It just emphasizes how much emotion the author has for such a beautiful creature, what he makes seem to be such a beautiful creature. The final annotation that I made for the Loon on Forrester's Pond was the last sentence in the whole poem, and it states, "It seemed the real only sanity to me," and this, we touched upon it in class, but we never really got into it. I put a question mark and an exclamation point right past this because this part of the poem surprised me. Normally when you say somebody's a loon or somebody's loony, you're telling them that they're crazy. Yet here you're talking about an animal that this person is witnessing, or what they seem to be witnessing, and yet they still make a reference back to what the other meaning of loon was, and the way that the author touches on, "It seemed the real only sanity to me." So it surprised me, and it puzzled me that he decides to bring the second meaning of the word he was talking about. He goes from talking about an animal and it going from it possibly being there to possibly not being there, and he touches on both meanings, which surprised me and confused me as to what he wanted to do with that.